They were not warriors. They carried no swords, wore no armor, and had no thrones. But these 12 men shook empires, stood against the might of Rome, and paid the ultimate price, not for treasure, power, or conquest, but for a message. A message so powerful, so world-altering, that it turned fishermen into martyrs and traitors into saints. This is not just a story of their lives. This is the story of their ends, gruesome, unthinkable ends, each one a testament to unwavering faith. Peter, the outspoken leader, once swore he'd never abandon Jesus. Yet when the pressure came, he denied him 3 times before the rooster crowed. But failure didn't define him. He rose stronger, bolder. Peter preached across Asia Minor and ultimately arrived in Rome, where the Emperor Nero turned his wrath on Christians. Peter was arrested and sentenced to die by crucifixion, but he refused to be crucified like his Lord. Instead, he was nailed to a cross upside down, believing he wasn't worthy to die the same way as Jesus. He died slowly, blood draining from his head, gravity choking him with each breath, a grim echo of the man who had once walked on water in faith. James, the son of Zebedee, known as James the Greater, was the first of the apostles to be martyred.
He didn't die in some distant land, but in Jerusalem,
where Herod Agrippa had him executed by the sword. One account suggests that a man who falsely accused him saw James's courage and faith, and was so moved he converted, only to be executed alongside him. James was beheaded, his blood soaking the ground he once walked as a simple fisherman, now a soldier of truth. John, his brother, lived longer than any of the others, but longevity didn't spare him suffering. They tried to kill him, boiling him alive in oil. Yet miraculously, he survived unharmed. So instead of death, the Roman authorities exiled him to Patmos, a barren island. There, surrounded by stone and sea, he received visions that would become the Book of Revelation. Alone, broken and aged, he died not by sword but by solitude. The last of the 12, his end was not violent but still bitter. Andrew, Peter's brother, preached in what is now modern-day Russia and Greece. His reward for spreading the gospel? Crucifixion. But not just any crucifixion. He was tied, not nailed, to an X-shaped cross, so his death would be slower. It took 2 full days for life to leave his body. And in those 2 days, he continued to preach to passers-by, urging them to find hope in the same Christ who had led him to such an end. Death did not silence him. He made his last breath a sermon. Thomas, often remembered as Doubting Thomas, found his purpose in far-off India. He spread the gospel with fire and conviction. But in the end, he was speared to death by local priests who saw him as a threat. The doubter died a believer, pierced through by hatred, yet never renouncing his faith. His blood mixed with foreign soil, far from Jerusalem, far from Galilee, but close to heaven. Matthew, the tax collector turned disciple, penned the gospel that bears his name. He traveled to Ethiopia, where he was stabbed to death while celebrating Mass. A dagger ended his life, but not his legacy. The man once hated by his own people for collaborating with Rome became a symbol of transformation. Story of how grace rewrites destinies. Bartholomew, also known as Nathaniel, took the gospel to India and Armenia. The details of his death are among the most horrifying. He was flayed alive, his skin peeled from his body while he still breathed. Then he was beheaded, pain beyond imagination. Yet not once did he recant. His silence under torture shouted louder than any sermon. James the Less, son of Alphaeus, met his end in Jerusalem. He was thrown from the pinnacle of the temple, a fall meant to kill him. But it didn't. Broken and battered, he still clung to life. So his executioners beat him to death with a fuller's club. They couldn't silence him with the fall, so they used brute force. A man small in stature, perhaps, but colossal in faith. Simon the Zealot traveled far and wide, possibly reaching Persia. There he was reportedly sawn in half. The blade that tore through his body couldn't sever his soul from the mission he lived for. A former revolutionary, once zealous for political freedom, now died for a deeper cause, freedom from sin, not from Rome. Jude, also known as Thaddeus, preached in Mesopotamia. His death came by crucifixion, though some sources suggest he was hacked to death with an axe. Either way, it was a brutal end for a man whose writings echoed with peace and encouragement. He wrote of love, mercy, and perseverance, and died in the most violent way, his body broken but his spirit unshaken. Matthias, the man chosen to replace Judas Iscariot, spread the word in Cappadocia and the Caspian Sea region. His end is murky. Some say stoned, others say beheaded. Regardless of the method, He met death with the same resolve that had led him to join the ranks of men who had walked with Christ. And then there was Judas Iscariot, the traitor. He sold Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, then was consumed by regret. His end was not at the hands of others, but by his own. Overwhelmed by guilt, he hung himself. A death without redemption, a legacy stained with betrayal. His name forever etched as a symbol of treachery. Each of these men faced unimaginable suffering. They weren't crusaders wielding power. They were fishermen, tax collectors, skeptics, and zealots who believed in something bigger than themselves. Their ends were terrible. But in those ends, something extraordinary was born: the early church. Their blood watered the roots of faith that would stretch across continents. Across centuries, their lives, ended in pain, gave rise to a movement of hope. They died not because they were caught in some political plot, not because they were unlucky, but because they refused to deny what they had seen. They had walked with Jesus, heard his voice, touched his hands, and they were willing to die to make sure the world knew it too. This is not just the story of how 12 men died. It's the story of how truth lives on, even when every messenger falls. The world tried to silence them, but their silence only made the message louder. Their blood cried out from the earth and still does, echoing in every corner where hope flickers in the dark. Their terrible ends weren't the end at all. They were the beginning of something unstoppable. The agony they endured wasn't the price of fanaticism. It was the consequence of love. A love so radical, so world-defying, that it became a threat to the established order. Love for a man who had once washed their feet. Love for a message that made beggars feel like kings and made kings tremble on their thrones. Love for the truth that death was no longer the end. Even as swords were raised against their flesh, even as flames licked at their robes, even as chains bit into their wrists, they did not curse the heavens. They blessed their captors. They forgave their murderers. They sang while being dragged to crosses. They prayed while awaiting execution. There is a madness to that kind of peace, a stillness that confounds even the cruelest tormentor. But their courage didn't come from blind devotion. It came from what they had seen. They had witnessed death undone. They had seen a man crucified, buried, and then walking among them days later, speaking peace into their fears. That kind of resurrection rewires your understanding of pain, of purpose, of permanence. When death is no longer the final word, suffering loses its sting. And for them, every lash, every blow, every drop of blood spilled was just another chapter in a bigger story, a story that didn't end at the grave. And what of the world that watched them die? Did it stop them? No, it only accelerated the spread. Persecution didn't silence the gospel. It amplified it. The more they bled, the more people believed. Because no one dies for a lie. No one chooses torture for something they know to be false. The apostles' deaths weren't just tragic. They were evidence. Evidence that they believed beyond all reason, beyond all fear, beyond all comfort. And even now, centuries later, their stories haunt us. Not because of how they died, but because of why they died. These were not men chasing fame. They had no riches, no empires, no armies, only their voices and a truth they would not bury. They died in silence, but that silence thundered across generations. The dust of their bones still stirs the conscience of the world. Their deaths weren't heroic in the way movies portray bravery. They weren't glamorous. They were raw, cruel, slow. Yet in every broken rib, every crushed skull, every burning limb, something divine glimmered through, something eternal. It was not about escaping pain. It was about transforming it, taking the worst of what man could inflict and using it to testify to something no man could destroy. What if the real strength isn't found in survival, but in surrender? What if true power is not keeping your life, but giving it away for a cause greater than life itself? That was their creed. Not to live long, but to live true. Not to preserve the body, but to preserve the flame. The early church grew not because of marketing or politics, but because of blood. The apostles were the seeds, their deaths the rain, and faith was the harvest. Their enemies tried to end a movement by ending the messengers, but instead they became martyrs, messengers for all time. And so we remember them, not as tragic figures, but as founders. Not as victims, but as visionaries. They didn't go down screaming. They went down proclaiming. They didn't fight with steel. They fought with truth. And they won, because we are still speaking their names. Peter, James, John, Andrew, Thomas, Matthew, Bartholomew, James, the Less, Simon, Jude, Matthias, even Judas. The fallen one reminds us of the cost of betrayal. These names echo through cathedrals and caves, in whispers and in thunder, across every language and culture that has heard the name of Jesus. Their deaths were terrible, but their message? Unstoppable.